In this video, I'll be briefly responding to 3 common arguments against the doctrine of divine simplicity, which is the claim that God has no parts or divisions within his being. The first argument is the argument from different attributes, which goes like this. If God is simple, then God's wisdom is equivalent to God's power. A being's wisdom cannot be equivalent to its power, therefore God is not simple. The problem with this argument is that divine simplicity entails that God has no parts or divisions, but it does not entail that God's attributes cannot be conceptually distinguished from one another. Power is simply the ability to bring something about, and wisdom is simply the ability to know how to act properly. These attributes do not need to be separated in order to be conceptually distinguished, because they are simply descriptions of what God can do. They are not different physical features of God. It's not like one side of God consists of God's power and another side of God consists of his wisdom. So it's conceivable that God is one singular being without division, and yet is maximally powerful and maximally wise. The same can be said for all of God's attributes, because God is not a physical being divided by spatial or metaphysical limits. The next argument against simplicity is the argument from moto collapse, which goes like this. If God's being is simple, then God's being is equivalent to God's knowledge. So if God's being is necessary, then God's knowledge is necessary. If God's knowledge is necessary, then God's knowledge of his decision to create is necessary, and thereby God's act of creating is necessary. Therefore, if God's being is simple and necessary, then God's act of creating is necessary. This argument entails tension between God's necessity, freedom, and simplicity. However, I think God is equivalent to God's act of knowing, but that does not necessarily mean that God's act of knowing is equivalent to all of the content that God knows. So God can necessarily know that he creates without the content of that knowledge being necessary, because there could be a distinction between God's act of knowing and at least some of the content that is known. The final argument against God's simplicity is the argument from the Trinity, and it goes like this. If God is simple, then God's properties are all equivalent. If God is 3 distinct persons, then God's properties are not all equivalent. Therefore, if God is 3 distinct persons, then God is not simple. This argument seems straightforward as it points out a tension between Trinitarianism and divine simplicity. However, the argument is not so straightforward because the traditional Orthodox understanding of the Trinity is that all of the persons share the same divine substance and attributes equally. Therefore, the substance of God is not divided by God being a Trinity. The Trinitarian persons do not break God into different sections. So Trinitarianism entails that God is 3 distinct persons, but not that God is divided into different sections by being a Trinity. So Trinitarianism entails that God is one being in 3 distinct persons, but not that God is divided into different spatial sections by being a Trinity. Rather, the persons all share the same being equally, as the Father begets the Son to share the same being, and the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son to also share the same being. But one may think that surely there must be something that distinguishes the 3 persons, and that this feature would then be a complexity. However, since the persons all share the same being, there is not a separate feature that distinguishes the 3 persons. Rather, the persons are distinguished by the acts of generation and procession. So I do not see a contradiction between 3 persons sharing the same simple, undivided being. Overall, more can be said about these arguments and the objections that I have raised, but hopefully this clarifies how defenders of divine simplicity can respond to some objections against it. I don't claim that the objections I've raised are definitive, but I think they're worth thinking about. Thanks for watching.